All right, so we have a pretty meaty topic to discuss today, and these VIN workshops, which is what we refer to them as, are meant to be educational, and we look to find topics that are relevant of interest to folks who are thinking about creating their own companies, inventors of promising life science technologies, investors themselves, and all related adjacent folks. So some of these subjects that I'm going to be covering could easily be, enough for their own discussion. But we're also always looking for topics that are germane, high level interest to the attendees. So please, if you have ideas of topics that you'd like to hear, are there, segments of what I'm going to talk about that you'd like to dig more into, please add those to the Q&A function on Zoom. So best practices for creating life science startups. And, Calvin set the stage, kind of set the context of how the VIC, technology venture development group, the VIC investor network works, what our parameters are. But most of the team members of VIC have formed companies both within the VIC ecosystem as well as previously on our own. So we're familiar with both approaches, both doing it yourself versus working with a venture studio, venture creator, venture builder. So with these sort of caveats in place, I'm going to talk about why it's important to create these companies and how best to approach their creation. And I think this is probably the fourth or fifth VIC/VIN workshop that we've given. So some of the topics we've already covered, I'm going to refer to those as I move through the discussion. So, but in this, we're going to really focus on the most important key considerations for creating a new company, a startup based on life science innovation. And when I say that, I mean therapeutics, vaccines, medical devices, diagnostics, tools, reagents, consumables, analytical instruments. We don't invest in digital health. We don't invest in AI. That doesn't, demean it at all. It's just we've set parameters on what we're focused on. So there are some considerations for non-regulated. Can I show full screen? Yes, I can do full screen. Thank you for that. And let me go to slideshow. Is that okay? One person asked a question about increasing. And let me get my Q&A out of the screen. But we'll also really dig into how to formulate and execute a realistic operating plan during the initial phase of the startup. Now, what is that initial phase? It depends on the technology type. Therapeutics have a longer horizon, medical devices slightly shorter, and if it's a non-regulated technology, it's even more defined. We already had a workshop on identifying and assessing life science innovation that you're free to access. VIC has a YouTube channel. So if you Google VIC Technology Venture Development in YouTube, you should be able to find that. You can also, in the Q&A section, just provide your email address and say, please send me the link to this topic. And some considerations that I'll just cover very quickly are, I'm assuming some of you have an interest in maybe creating a new a startup. You've already created a company based on life science writ large innovation. And some of the questions you should be asking yourself are you the inventor or the business lead? And those are two very different perspectives. Inventors, yes, definitely will create their own company. We often will have conversations with inventors at universities, institutes, and national labs, discuss the VIC model, and they may say, hey, great model, I get it, but I'm gonna go on my own. And total respect, total credit for them doing that. That comes with its own set of considerations and even biases. I think most of us would agree. Or are you the business lead? Are you someone who's been there, done that before, created life science companies, had a few failures, had a few successes under your belt, and you know the drill? And one of the topics or considerations is that, inventors often lack objectivity. This has been their science, their life's work. They think their baby is beautiful, and maybe their baby is not really a viable, commercially viable technology. It's also very important, obviously, to get input from people outside the inner circle, right? Subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, people in industry, clinical experts, et cetera, to really validate the opportunity. Is there a clear unmet market need? and market opportunity. Whereas the asset in the development continuum, right? Is it very early? Have animal studies been done? The right animal studies? Is it moving into IND enabling preclinical? Very rarely will you see an asset that is clinical development ready. So we're really not going to talk about it from that perspective. It's more, preclinical, but that's a big world, and that can take 3 to 7 years or more to go from where it is now to entering the clinic, and that also has certain impacts. Is the opportunity sufficient to merit a new co? We see lots of technologies at Vic Technology Venture Development that are really interesting, and they may have commercial opportunity, but in and of themselves, they're not sufficient to create a new company entirely focused on developing the technology. They're more of a reagent or a tool that would make sense in a Thermo Fisher portfolio or a Danaher portfolio, but probably would not achieve sufficient market size, revenue size to attract an acquirer, which is really the end game from our perspective. Is it fundable, right? Are ultimately VCs going to see this as having enough upside that they're going to invest millions, tens of millions, even maybe hundreds of millions of dollars? Do you have both dilutive and non-dilutive funding opportunities? And when I say non-dilutive, I mean grants and contracts and maybe partnering. And then what is the end game? Our end game is acquisition. We're not looking at these as long-term operating companies per se, or going the IPO route for a number of reasons. So if you've checked all those boxes, thumbs up, fantastic. Now what do you do as the inventor of the technology, as the business lead? And this is sort of the agenda of what I'm going to cover in the next, say, 30 minutes is, okay, create the operating strategy. Where is the product now? What milestones are you going to need to reach to do what? To raise additional funding, to attract talent, to attract the attention of a potential acquirer. How much money is it going to take to do that? What kind of resources, both in-house and external, can you tap into, given the fact that the company is going to be very cash lean during its initial, startup phase? Forming the new co, some structural elements that I'll very superficially touch, but that should be a part of any sort of startup template, startup package for a company that you're creating. Licensing the asset. Okay, you've created the NewCo. Now the NewCo needs to license the asset from the source institution, the university, the national lab, the institute. And then the always important question of, is this going to be a brick and mortar operation, or is it going to be a virtual operation, or some hybrid of both? So a lot of this depends on the type of technology that you're looking at. Is it a therapeutic? Is it a medical device? Is it a diagnostic? Is it an other? And even within those buckets, there are other considerations, right? So what's the modality of your therapeutic? Is it a small molecule, large molecule, biologic? And those bring with them associated assumptions about costs, risks, manufacturing complexity, regulatory considerations. Is this going to CDER or CBER, right? What indication are you in? Certain diseases, therapeutic areas are much more expensive to develop a new therapeutic opportunity in. So that's something that also needs to be taken into consideration. It might be even more difficult to recruit patients for your clinical studies, so forth and so on. Does your drug address an orphan indication? Does it have fast track or emergency use authorization for, say, a vaccine for a pandemic threat? And then again, what is the current stage of development? And we often see presentations by the inventor of the technology, a university professor, say, and they've to their credit, they've gone ahead and put together a rough but sincere estimate of what the costs are going to be, at least in the early phase of development. And what we often see is a gross underestimate of the time it's going to take to go from where it is now to an IND ready asset. Here it shows 4 to 7 years. I think that's pretty accurate. That it could take at least 4 years to go from something that's got really good proof of concept animal results but still has the entire preclinical process to go through, and that includes ADMET, GMP, GLP, pre-IND, IND, et cetera. It's also, of course, important to take into account how far into the clinical development continuum do you plan to take this asset? Our model, and this, I know this is a gross simplification, but our model is to get human efficacy data for a therapeutic. And that could be a phase 1B, a phase 2A, maybe a full phase 2. We really don't have intentions to go into a full phase 3, primarily because the cost and the time associated with doing that. We believe that if we can show very strong efficacy data in that late phase 1, early phase 2 study, that may be enough for acquisition by a larger organization. Maybe it won't be. Maybe we'll need to take it to a phase 2B or even a phase 3, but that comes with it very different capital requirements. And there's a lot of information out there. I think there's a Nature Biotechnology review that really goes into in-depth discussion about, okay, what does clinical development look like categorized by different therapeutic areas? And you can see that you go to much more expensive indications or TAs as you get into oncology, ophthalmology, pain and anesthesia. But dermatology, topical applications, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular. I would have thought cardiovascular would have been up there and the most expensive, but this is a bit counterintuitive to me. You can also get information on the per patient cost for a phase 1, a phase 2, or a phase 3 clinical study for specific either therapeutic areas, broad therapeutic areas, and even sometimes indications, if they're very popular indications or diseases with a lot of drug development activity. So the information's out there, and you can from this build a fairly realistic, defensible, and detailed analysis of what it's going to cost to at least get into early clinical development. And then shifting gears into medical devices and diagnostics, obviously they come with their own considerations and specifications. What class of medical device are you developing? 1, 2, or 3? Is it a Band-Aid? Is it something that is implanted but not as likely to cause severe issue if it malfunctions? Or if it's something that is much more invasive, you're looking at a PMA. Their costs go up, complexities of clinical development go up, timelines for clinical development goes up. And this is just a snapshot of different types of technologies and where they fall in the different categories of medical device development. So again, a lot of information out there. If what's your most closely related medical device or diagnostic technology on this list, and you can say, okay, what's it going to cost me to get there? And interestingly enough, who's funding this area? So to put down your short list of potential investors. And from this creates your sort of master timeline, which includes your dilutive fundraising goals, estimates, your non-dilutive fundraising aspirations, and then where your technology is for one application, or maybe has multiple applications. It could be used for disease 1, disease 2, disease 3. It's the same technology, but for different market opportunities. And again, this is an example. In this case, I'm talking about a therapeutic. I'm talking about a therapeutic that has excellent small animal and large animal data. When let's say we looked at it and decided to form a company around it, there have been some preliminary PK/PD tox work done, not IND enabling, but that's just the start point for this particular example. So let's say we create this company and we want to raise a $500,000 seed round. Could be more, could be less. But we think that $500,000 is enough to get the company going and to give us the runway to go out there, maybe raise that Series A, or win an SBIR proposal, apply for contracts from the DoD, et cetera. Now, these are aligned. These are not arbitrary. How long the 500,000 and then when the Series A or the Series B round is likely to occur, right? These are based on product development milestones saying, okay, when we get to the IND and want to start the phase one, we're going to need X amounts, and not just to limp across the finish line. We want to have enough to come across the finish line in good shape and not on fumes, right? So to give us that extra amount that we'll need to get to the Series B or the Series C. We often hear from both inventors of technologies as well as maybe, and again, we don't invest in pre-existing companies, but we do get approached by pre-existing companies, and maybe they were formed to apply for SBIRs. Maybe they were formed by the inventor, but nothing's really happened. And sometimes we hear, well, SBIRs take a long time to get, and they don't provide that much funding. And so it becomes sort of this vicious cycle, right? That you never go after this funding because it's going to take too long. Our mentality is that you should be aggressively pursuing grant and contract funding, because you don't know what the venture capital climate is going to be right now. It's not great for early stage life science companies. And a $500,000 phase one SBIR, or a $3 million phase two SBIR, or a $5 million contract from ARPA-H or BARDA, or a $20 million contract from ARPA-H can make a huge difference as far as moving the technology along without diluting the current shareholders in the company, getting the technology further along, and thus, you would think, increasing the pre-money valuation for when you do go out and raise that dilutive funding, right? The company's in better shape. The technology has been de-risked to a certain extent. It's more mature. So you're just in a better place to raise that $5, $10, $15 million round from venture capital. And then all that information that I showed previously about how to create a realistic time frame for when you're going to get to the pre-IND meeting, the IND, the phase one. That's all very important, because when you go out and pitch to investors, this is what they're going to take a hard look. I mean, they're going to take a hard look at everything, right? But this is what they're really going to kind of zero in on, is that, does this person have a realistic idea how much money it's going to take and how much time it's going to take to these different time points, these different value enhancing milestones? And if you're wildly off base, you're wildly, optimistic about how quickly and how cheaply you're going to do these things, and that sets off some warning signs in their minds. So accessing resources, and this is kind of a chicken and the egg topic, in that you haven't started the company yet, or you've just started the company yet. You can't really afford to pay anybody until you raise that call it angel or seed round, or you bring in that non-dilutive funding, that grant or contract. So how can you embrace resources that will help you create a believable opportunity, right? So who's going to be the PI on your grant proposal? If it's an SBIR, it is not going to be the inventor of the technology if they're still at the university, right? Because to be the PI on your SBIR, they have to be a 51% employee of the company. Sometimes postdocs in the inventor's lab can fulfill that role, take a at least 51% role in the company. Maybe they're 49% in the inventor's lab at the university, but they have the credentials, the pedigree to be a believable PI on that proposal. So that's sort of a creative way to get around that, or to address that requirement. But also, if you've been in this industry long enough, you probably know some really good, easy to work with, and capable folks who are experts in preclinical development with therapeutics, with small molecules, or with biologics, or folks who have some regulatory affairs or clinical planning, implementation. You can have conversations with CROs, right? Or CMOs or consultants. And Often they will give you feedback, give you guidance, write letters of support for your proposals that you're submitting, provide you with, what's their budget going to need to be on that proposal, and that gives you credibility, right? If you're bringing in a Charles River Labs or an IQVIA or a PPD or fill in the blank, right? But a well-regarded, um, highly respected CRO, CMO, clinical regulatory outfit, and that doesn't cost you anything. They want your business when you get the funding. It's also very important to build a multidisciplinary team, right? People with different perspectives, people who aren't afraid to question the dogma, right? Who aren't afraid to, let's say you're the business lead, you're the CEO of the company, but you want people surrounding you who are going to say, well, I don't know if that makes sense. My experience tells me that we'd be better off doing it this way. That's what you look for. You don't want people who are just going to go with the flow all the time, because this is a really tough industry to be in, and you want experts, and you want them because they can provide you with that knowledge. And then the culture, even if this is a very small, lean startup, you're all virtual, having positive culture is important because you've got somebody who's not a team player, somebody who's not collaborative, or somebody who's disrupting the ability of your team to do their best. That's something that you need to address very, very quickly. So the brick and mortar, the specifics of creating the company, you often get asked, I often get asked, okay, C Corp versus LLC. Definitely C Corp, right? Because venture capital typically will not invest in LLC. And it's better to take the long-term, deeper workload to create the C Corp than the short-term savings of creating that, state LLC, Delaware C Corp. And you can get templated documents to support that process. It also means that you don't have to deal with the K-1 forms for the managers of the LLC, so forth and so on. So go ahead, bite the bullet, start off as a C Corp. And then there's this checklist of things you need to do in rapid succession, right? So obtain an EIN, create and sign the articles, also known as certificates of incorporation. And then I've just summarized what these key formational documents do. It's not rocket science. They're necessary, and they really provide guardrails or spell out how things will happen in the event of this situation. So they're very important to have those in place from day one. The bylaws, right? So they discuss, and the bylaws can be different by state, but again, I would recommend Delaware. But they really encompass, when do shareholder meetings need to happen? How will a vote happen? How are things approved in meetings and outside of meetings? How do you elect or remove board members? Details on, the conduct of board meetings, rights and obligations of company officers, and indemnification of directors and officers to reduce liability. And the shareholder agreement. So what happens to the shares in a variety of situations, the death of the shareholder, divorce of the shareholder, how are shares bought and sold? You need to have initial cap table. So day one of creation of the company, have that cap table already in place. Who's getting the founders / common shares in the company? The CEO of the company, maybe the inventor of the technology, the licensor of the technology, right? University X. In their license agreement, they may require that they get 5, 10, fill in the blank percent of the equity, in addition to everything else that they want in the license agreement. And then other items, right? So we very quickly want to create a website domain or secure your website domain. You should do that in the naming process, right? So you're coming up with names for the new co. Go on to, we used to use Google domains, but now they're part of Squarespace. So go on Squarespace and try and find the .com version of it, and secure that for $12 a year. Set up the email using the domain, write a press release announcing the formation of the new co, but you want to have your website in place, ideally, before that happens, so you can point people back to it. And then if you are applying for government grants and contracts, which you will, you need to start this whole spectrum of different registration steps once you have your EIN number. So DUNS number, register at grants.gov, SAMS, SBA, ERA Commons for NIH, Fastlane for NSF. More specialized, like DoD entities have their own registration, DSIP. Join any sort of disease focused, especially DoD, but also foundations, right? Cystic Fibrosis or Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, or you're going after funding through lots of acronyms out in the government, no surprise. You're going after funding through MDC, MCDC, or Biomap, or RRPV, or these different clearinghouses for very large grants and or contracts, both domestic and international. So really know what the funding ecosystem looks for you, for your technology, for your disease or indication. And this can take a month or more. You need an address for this. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Licensing the asset. You form the company, you've got all your legal documents in place. Now you want to pull that license, and hopefully you've negotiated this weeks or months ahead of time so that you've got, essentially, we've agreed to these terms. I just need to form the company, and then I'll come back and license the asset. Maybe there's an option agreement in place so nobody else can come and take it from under you. This could be a fairly challenging discussion. And what I've shown here, and this was a subject of a white paper that I wrote a little while ago. You can find it on the VIC website. You can also find it on my LinkedIn page. But what are the different components of a license, and what are the expectations from the licensor, in this case, a university, versus the NewCo? And we've had discussions with universities that had technology that we were interested in creating a new company for, where the upfront license fee was as much as $500,000. And we're investing $500,000 to create the company, so that's a non-starter, right? We don't want that entirety of that money going back to the licensor. Actually, we'd like to retain as much of the funding for the company to advance the asset forward. So that's a discussion that needs to happen. That's a topic that needs to be emphasized during the license negotiations. What is the university's goal here? Is it to get this technology out to prove itself? Still early stage. At that point in time that we look at it, it has not been really de-risked that much, and there's a lot of hard work and money that needs to be applied to get this through preclinical, maybe into the clinic if we're lucky, and maybe to a successful product if we're super, super lucky. So, the university may want tens of thousands of dollars. We would prefer to keep it to 1% of what we're investing. So if we're investing $500,000, $5,000. Equity, they may expect none. Some university term sheets have no equity component. Some have, we want 50% of the company. I kid you not. They often will ask for anti-dilution protection, and our pushback there is that nobody on the cap table has anti-dilution protection. The inventor, the founders, investors, etc. So why should the university get anti-dilution protection? And then often you hear, well, it's because we've invested so much money in this technology, and not actually, you haven't. The inventor got federal funding in the form of basic research grants to fund it, and the university got the indirects and overheads off that. In some cases, yes, the university did have a gap fund or some incentives to apply to move the technology further, and that may be hundreds of thousands of dollars. We get it, but at the same time, we want to structure and position this license agreement to optimize the chances of success for this NewCo. Also, we want to have a license that is fundable by a venture capital firm when they come in, a larger venture capital firm, and we don't have to go back and renegotiate because they say, no, these terms, they're not gonna, this is not viable. So we really take the long view on these license agreements. And then royalty, minimum annual royalty, sub-license revenue share, maintenance fees, milestone payments, patent reimbursement costs. There are endless numbers of ways to slice this and to find ways to put in additional fees and costs that can very quickly tax a lean startup, especially in that first 2 to 3 year period. So try and be careful to avoid a front-end loaded license agreement if you are, aspiring entrepreneur. And then the question of physical versus virtual. The VIC model, and again, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but the VIC model is, we're very flexible as far as where the new co we create is located. Now, located could mean that it is, we have a virtual tenant agreement with an incubator on a university, but it's in close proximity to where the inventor is. Now, that assumes that the technology is still at a point where some of the work can be done in the inventor's lab, either via a subaward and an SBIR or sponsored research agreement back from the company. Sometimes the technology is far enough along where it's beyond the capability of an academic research lab and has to be done in a GLP, GMP setting. So then we're going to be working with CROs. In that case, maybe it doesn't need to be in close proximity to the inventor. Also, VIC applies or provides the operating team to run the company. So myself as a managing director, I'll serve as the interim CEO for one or more of our companies during the first 3 to 5 year, startup phase. Do I want the entity to be closer to me, or do I have a CSO who's in the Bay Area, and I want it to be closer to them? We're typically not building a lot of wet lab capability because that's very expensive. We're renting wet lab space. Maybe we can find something that's affordable at that university incubator. In some cases, universities can be very flexible, and they may have lab space, a bench that we can rent from the university. But also being able to bring in those external experts, right, from CROs, CMOs, CDMOs, consultants, et cetera, on an as needed basis really helps control the costs. And just another point with VIC, as do many venture studios, venture creators, venture builders, but bringing in the management team, including R&D expertise, regulatory expertise, on a fractional basis, right? So I might be the 33% CEO of the company, but I can tap into a VIC team member who's got experience in small molecule or large molecule drug development on a 25%. And so being able to tap into those people across all of our portfolio companies or some of our portfolio companies really makes sense from a financial perspective. I'm not going to talk about the difference between incubators and accelerators. There are a lot of these out there, and some of them are good, some of them are not so good. So just be very careful if you are contemplating this, that you really do your due diligence on them. So the happy medium for me is a virtual tenant lease with an option for future wet lab space if needed. So we're there, we've got the address, we can go through all the registration processes. And if we in the future need to have that lab space, then we can tap into it. Okay, now let's execute the plan. We've created the company structurally, we've licensed the asset, we know who our team members are going to be, at least during 1.0 of this company, and it may be as it evolves and matures, we need to bring in additional folks with different skill sets. So again, I can't emphasize this enough, right? Aggressively pursue both dilutive and non-dilutive funding simultaneously. There's not one than the next. It happens both. And investors, when you go out and pitch your opportunity and you've not pursued non-dilutive funding, that's also a red flag, right? Why didn't you? And you better have a pretty damn good reason why you decided not to go after hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions in free federal funding, or state and regional funding, or disease-focused foundation funding. Why didn't you go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? Why didn't you go to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation? Why haven't you pursued DoD or NSF or NIH funding for this? Create your investor pitch and practice it with your team, including advisors, including mentors, including people who are going to give you, real unfettered feedback, and people who've gone out and raised funding for a life science startup or a startup in your space or something similar to what you've done. That's huge because you don't want to be in a situation where you are pitching to potential investors, be they angels, angel networks, seed investors, VCs, corporate VCs, et cetera, and get asked questions that you can't answer. You need to have those questions already in your back pocket, and the way in which you present the technology is also very important. Do you come off as being knowledgeable but not defensive, right? So if somebody asks you a hard question or basically insults your technology, you don't lose your composure. You're also going to need a whole host of other collateral to support the fundraising process, right? In addition to your 15-slide investor pitch, don't do death by science. You don't want a 30, 40, 50-page presentation. Your first presentation, the intro presentation, non-confidential, and 15 slides. I'm pretty ruthless about that because you will quickly lose your audience if you go into slide after slide after slide after slide after slide of science and data. So you're going to need an executive summary, obviously a very polished professional website with meaningful information on it, links to the publications, links to enabling information, etc. And in your, let's call it deal room, which could be Dropbox or a folder on your hard drive, you also want the list of information that's going to support the due diligence process by a prospective investor. It's very awkward when you do give that pitch and they say, okay, we're interested. Please send us the link to your deal room, or here's our checklist of due diligence information, which can be quite lengthy. Please send us. And if you don't have that information and send that to them within a couple of days, you can lose their attention. And it also doesn't look good, right? You want that information all in place. A lot of it is the company information documents, any consulting agreements, detailed financials, etc. You should have that assembled and ready to go. Build a network of investor contacts. So, in the good old days, you would use an Excel spreadsheet to implement your fundraising, right? Here's the firm, here's the email address, here's what I sent on what day, did they get back to me or not? If they did, what happened next? It is worth using a CRM and a marketing automation tool. I use HubSpot. Vic uses HubSpot. You can get a free version of it, which is very usable, especially during the first year or two of a startup company, to really track your fundraising activities, your partnering activities, building a list of contacts and sending out periodic updates or a newsletter, your investors, keeping them informed of any, information that they need to be aware of, et cetera. Non-dilutive funding, I hate to harp on this, but this is super important, right? So identify realistic sources of funding for your technology at its stage. Some funding sources like BARDA may have TRL, technology readiness level requirements, TRL 4, 5, 6. So if you're preclinical, pre-IND, you're not TRL 6, you're probably TRL 5 or maybe 4. So try and align yourself with those maturity requirements of the different organization. Keep a spreadsheet or a list of these funding opportunities and build a team of people who can help you. Maybe the inventor writes the specific aims and the research strategy. You as the business lead write the commercialization plan. You've got somebody helping you, a program manager who can help you put together all the different components of those proposals and get it out. And there may be different registration requirements. There are different portals, different mechanisms for uploading those proposals. So make sure you do your homework months in advance, because some of them have some pretty onerous requirements for you to be able to join the consortium or to submit the proposal. Also, couch your expectations. Proposals rarely get funded on first submission. So take to heart the reviewer's criticisms. I put in the lower right-hand corner here that, like for NIH, what are the categories? You're most likely to get dinged on approach, right? They didn't like the research strategy that you were taking, what experiments you were going to do, how many animals, what the controls were going to be, et cetera. And don't forget about partnering, right? So maybe you've got a technology which is amenable to some sort of alliance with an external entity that could generate revenue as well. Operations, I'm going to move pretty quickly through this, and a lot of these could be the subject for a separate discussion, but R&D, right? You're in this catch-22 where you want to keep the research going forward, but you may not have the funding, the necessary funding to do that. Obviously, when you created the company, hopefully you had some modest funding lined up, friends and family, angel investors, gap funding from that university, incentives from your city, county, state, etc. Some states do have, quick aside, some states do have matching grants. So, if you get an SBIR, they'll match it, or if you bring in funding, they'll match it. It might be, 2-to-1, 1-to-1, but definitely look into those incentives programs. Keep your team engaged and on track. So if you're a virtual team, weekly meetings, maybe 2 meetings per week, one on a specific project, but then just a general catch-up meeting with all the different stakeholders. And always be on the lookout for talent too, because you never know when you're going to need to grow your team. And it's nice to have a short list of folks. Oh, that person would be great as a program manager, or that person would be great as my, head of R&D. IP, right? So you've licensed IP from the university. The university owns that IP, but that doesn't mean that the company won't develop its own IP moving forward. And that's ideal because you don't want to be on the hook for yet more license terms and payments for future IP if it is company developed. So be very careful to track who invented, who created, who came up with that idea. And if it's somebody who's a company employee, then that's company IP. If it's both company personnel and the university personnel, then that's co-own, co-inventorship. If it's only university, then it's the university IP. So make sure you track that carefully. Keep legal costs under control. So you can do a lot of the legal grunt work yourself. You can write the MTA, you can write the collaborative research agreement, the CRADA. You can write the NDAs, get a template NDA, etc. Write it, proofread it, get feedback from the other entity, and then that's, if you need to, you may not need to, but if you need to, that's the time to have your legal resource take a quick look at it. Marketing, very important. This is something that a lot of startups miss, is that you want to keep your company on the radar screen, unless you're in stealth mode. Totally get that. But if you have, interest in raising non-dilutive and dilutive funding, it's good to get the word out that there's this exciting new company. It's got a great technology, innovative technology that's going to really address a lot of unmet need. And then keep an eye on your competition, right? So who's active in the same technology? Where are they? Are they raising funding? Are they in clinical studies? Was the clinical study successful, or did it fail? How's that going to impact you?